Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and detailed Kafka guide. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to get the most value out of Kafka, how to build her and play her efficiently, so that you guys can see Kafka's full potential as a very strong lightning damage over time or DOT carry who can really shine when played and built efficiently. Kafka is one of the most popular and hyped characters who is finally here, and so I want to tell you guys everything you need to know about her in this video. Before we begin, I want you guys to know though that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with all that being said, let's get right into it. Alright, so starting things off, what does Kafka actually do? Well, Kafka is a DOT carry whose main playstyle relies on spamming her skill and also her ultimate and her talent, apply shock to enemies, and deal a decent amount of lightning damage herself, while also dealing more damage based on the DOTs that are applied on enemies. In fact, how she works is as follows. First of all, Kafka's skill will deal lightning damage to a primary target and then also a smaller amount to adjacent enemies, while also making your target enemy take more DOT damage equal to a significant amount of said DOT's original damage. DOT standing for damage over time, and this can be any DOT. It can be Kafka's shock, it can be, for example, Sampo's wind shear or Luca's bleed, which are two characters that are actually strong with Kafka, as we'll see in the team comp section later, meaning that Kafka can just make the most out of the DOTs applied on enemies and really synergize well with other DOT characters. Similarly, Kafka's ultimate will deal lightning damage to all enemies, have a chance to shock them, and then make these enemies take additional damage from this shock state. If that wasn't enough, when you unlock your major trace called Torture, which I highly recommend unlocking, you will actually make these enemies take damage not just from the shock that is applied, but also from any DOT source that is currently on them, making them take that damage immediately. Because of this, using Kafka's ultimate and her skill once DOTs are already applied on enemies will make it to where your Kafka not only has good personal damage, but will also increase the DOT damage that enemies are taking by just making enemies take an additional amount of damage equal to a very high amount of the original damage of whatever DOT is applied on the enemies. Do keep in mind that Kafka's ultimate has a 100% base chance of enemies to get shocked, but this base chance actually goes up once you do get another major trace, this one called Thorns, which will increase the base chance to apply shock by 30%, making it effectively 130%, meaning that you really only need a little bit of hit rate to guarantee that you're applying shock to enemies, which is something that we'll cover in the Relic stats section a bit later in the video. Moving on, for Kafka's talent, Gentle but Cruel, this one will give you a follow-up attack that is triggered when one of Kafka's allies triggers a basic attack. This is something that is very easy to do, as oftentimes you'll have at least like a healer character basic attack passively or another party member, allowing your Kafka to trigger a follow-up attack, dealing lightning damage to the target, and also having this same base chance to apply shock to them 130% once you get the Thorns trace, with this shock being the same as your ultimate and lasting for 2 turns. If that wasn't enough, whenever your Kafka defeats an enemy who is shocked, you will gain a free 5 energy, which is a nice passive that you unlock once again through a major trace. Also, keep in mind that you gain 18% effect hit rate for free from your minor traces. It'll be 18% total if you get all 3, and you also get a bunch of attack, like 28%, again from your minor traces. So be sure to get these, level all of your traces, and also unlock the major and minor ones if you have the resources to. Lastly, for Kafka's technique, this is a good way to start the battle, especially if you want to shock enemies or if you don't have your ultimate available, as when you use it, it will enter the battle by dealing lightning damage to all enemies with this same 100% or 130% chance to apply shock to enemies with your major trace unlocked, again being the same as the one applied on your ultimate. So a good way to make sure there's a DOT applied on all enemies before starting the combat, again especially being relevant if you don't have your ultimate available to immediately apply shock to everyone. Because of this, Kafka's playstyle is a very unique one and one that we have to talk about. In fact, Kafka is a character who wants to be spamming her skill and basically never basic attack to really get the most value out of all the DOTs that are currently placed on the enemies. Your ultimate's big hit, your talent's follow-up attack, and your technique are all ways to apply shock, apply a DOT on enemies, while then dealing more damage based on the DOT's original damage from your ultimate and also from your skill, which are two things that you want to be spamming. Kafka therefore has very high synergy with other DOT characters, notably nihility ones like Sampo or Luca, but also some others like Serval or resistance shredding supports like Silverwolf or Pila, who we'll talk about again in the team section when we cover the best ways to build a Kafka team. Because of this though, because of how much DOTs you can apply and damage from the DOTs of your team, this means that Kafka is in a very unique role where she has some really strong characters she can synergize with, very unique teams and also very unique builds, and can be a very accessible character. Some of her best supports or sub DPSs are on her banner. She has a very accessible free-to-play Lycone and extremely flexible relics, and also relic stats, as you don't really want crit on her for a reason we'll cover in the next section, but basically DOTs can't crit and those are a big portion of your damage, so you want to be stacking other stats than crit, meaning that she's a very unique character to build, but one one that is very free-to-play friendly, and one who I really like and believe is a very strong character. I think Kafka is very unique. I really like her design, really like her playstyle, and also think she's strong if you are playing and building her correctly. But in my opinion, you do need a good build and you do need a good team comp. You need to know how to play her to actually get the most value out of her and make her feel strong. She is also somewhat future-proof, as she will only get better as more DOT characters are released that can synergize with Kafka. I love her playstyle and her design, and do want to emphasize the fact that as long as you know how to build her and her teams, you can get a lot of value out of her even as a free-to-play player. Alright, now moving on to how you want to build Kafka, we're going to start by talking about the best Lycons for her, and you should be pleased to know that there's some great 4-star Lycon options, as well as a very decent free-to-play one, so that everyone can have a good Lycon for Kafka. Now, since Kafka is one of the Nihility characters that is more on the damage dealing side, and the DOTs more so than debuffing enemies, where she's more comparable to someone like Sampo than someone like Pila or Silverwolf, this means that the Lycons you're looking for are those that increase your damage of your Kafka herself, and also the damage of her DOTs. Because of that, the best Lycons you're going to be going for are the following. First of all, her signature Lycon is obviously going to be her best, as not only are the base stats high, but the effect will give you a lot of damage percent, 24% at S1, while also increasing your speed by almost 15% if you can fully stack it, and you gain 1 stack each time your Kafka attacks, while also having an additional effect that will apply a lightning DOT on enemies through an effect called Erode when your Kafka damages them. And so because of all of this, and notably the pretty high amount of damage and speed that you're gaining, this will be the best Lycon on your Kafka. How valuable it is as a pull though, and how it compares to your E1 will depend on the other Lycon options you have, as the upgrade from your free-to-play option, Fermata, which we'll talk about shortly, and this one is pretty big, but the difference between this Lycon and your fully superimposed 4-star option, which you can get just by pulling on any banner, is not actually that high. It's only a few percents, because Kafka does have an amazing 4-star option that you may already have. This option is Good Night and Sleep Well, which gains a ton of value the more superimpositions you have on it. This is because this Lycon will give you a ton of damage to just your entire kit. In fact, your damage dealt is increased by 24%, stacking up to 3 times for each debuff the enemy has. Now, this 24% is at superimposition level 5. At S1, it's 12%, which is still good, but obviously it doubles at S5, and this amount that you're gaining here, either 12 or 24, can be multiplied 3 times if there are 3 debuffs on an enemy, which is something that you can very consistently get in an optimal Kafka team if you play her the way I'm going to be showing you in this guide. Because of that, this Lycon will give you up to 36% damage at S1, or up to 72% at S5, which is absolutely insane, and this is damage that also applies to the DOT. Because of that, this Lycon is really not far behind your signature if you do have it fully superimposed, but even at low superimposition level, it's still a great option. However, do note that you have an amazing free-to-play option with Kafka that is comparable in strength to a low superimposition level Good Night and Sleep Well, but worse than an S5 one. This Lycon is Fermata. Fermata is going to be one of your go-to options, a great free-to-play option that you can get and superimpose for free from the shop at the Forgotten Hall. This gives you a great baseline Lycon if you don't have either of the 2 Lycons that I mentioned previously. As I said, it can be even better than Good Night and Sleep Well S1, typically being very similar in strength though, and worse than an S5 one. This weapon is great because it gives you a ton of damage percent, 32% at S5, to enemies afflicted with shock or wind shear, and if you're running Kafka, and maybe even Sampo, then this is very easy to get, just a free 32% damage for your Kafka. On top of that, it'll also increase your break effect, so that's a bonus, but this damage percent just makes it a great free-to-play option that I really think most players should be using if they don't have the other Lycons that we talked about. With that in mind, there are some other ones that I wanted to mention. For example, Incessant Rain, which is Silverwolf's Lycon, that I recommend using on Silverwolf or another character that wants hit rate more, but can still be fine, and a bit better than her free-to-play option generally speaking, but you probably didn't pull this to use on Kafka. Welt's Lycon, which gives you damage and attack, and typically is about as good as your free-to-play option. Lastly, I also wanted to mention the Eyes of the Prey Lycon, which can give you a lot of DOT damage and also increase your effect hit rate, but again, as we will see, you don't need the most effect hit rate, especially on an E0 Kafka, so it is a Lycon that can be better utilized on a character like Sampo, who you may be using alongside your Kafka anyways, but a perfectly viable option for your Kafka as well, especially if you need the hit rate, but if not, the other options that I mentioned, again, would be more recommended. And so overall, I think it is great that Kafka has such a strong free-to-play Lycon with Fermata, but also great options to upgrade, like Good Night and Sleep Well, and her signature Patience is All You Need Light Cone. Alright, now with that in mind, let's talk about the relics you want on Kafka. First of all, for your relic sets, it is generally pretty straightforward. To maximize your damage, Band of Sizzling Thunder, the 4-piece, is going to be the best for you. This is because you'll get 10% lightning damage bonus from the 2-piece, and then 20% attack from the 4-piece set when you use your skill, and Kafka is a character who wants wants to spam her skill, so you'll have good uptime on this 4-piece. With that in mind, you can also mix and match 2-piece sets to get very similar amounts of value than the 4-piece, as just getting a lot of stats on your Kafka is always going to be great. In fact, going the 2-piece Band of Sizzling Thunder will give you 10% lightning damage, and then you can also mix and match this with any of the other offensive 2-piece sets like Musketeer for 12% attack, or also the Messenger for 6% speed. Now, keep in mind though, there's other sets you can go, like even the 4-piece Musketeer. You can technically do some break effect things with the 4-piece Thief of Shooting Meteor, but we'll cover this a bit more in the artifact stats section. But the most important thing to note with Kafka is that you want to go based on your stats and substats, as there's no real game-breaking set for her, so feel free to mix and match 2-pieces or go for a best of slot 4-piece Band of Sizzling Thunder, depending on your stats and substats. With that said, for your Planar Ornaments, the answer is generally very straightforward. Just go for Space Stealing Station, as you'll get 24% attack for free, assuming you have 120 speed or higher, which is something that you want on Kafka. Also, while the Space Stealing Station is definitely going to be the recommended option, I want to mention that again, based on your stats, you can also go for some other sets like Pan Galactic Commercial Enterprise if you want a lot of hit rate, like notably with your E1 or your Signature Light Cone, or some other more niche sets like Fleet of the Ageless to give your whole team a bunch of attack, or 8% attack to be more specific. Or again, if you want to do some break effect things, which I don't typically recommend, but you can go for the break effect set. Generally speaking though, just go for Space Stealing Station on your Kafka for 24% attack and you'll have a good time. Now, the reason why you're choosing these relic sets that give you attack or speed over things like crit rate and crit damage, or even break effect, is because that's generally how you're going to maximize your Kafka's damage. In fact, let's actually talk about what stats you're looking for to get the most value out of Kafka. Well, as we saw, since a lot of Kafka's damage doesn't only come from her scalings, from her abilities themselves, but also from the DOT, the damage over time that you apply onto enemies, going for crit is not going to be as optimal as going for stats like attack or speed, because your DOTs are a significant amount of your damage, and DOTs can't crit. They don't scale on crit, which means that going for attack will not just increase the scalings of your damage, but they'll also increase the scalings of your DOT, meaning it is a more valuable stat to you, contributing to all of your sources of damage and not just like half of them. So generally speaking, you want attack and you also want speed, because speed is generally very useful on Kafka, not only to hit certain speed breakpoints that we'll talk about shortly, but also to be able to just move as much as you can before opponents, while also using your skill as often as possible to deal more damage onto DOT afflicted enemies, being a great stat overall that you want to look for. Now, to go into more detail, the exact amount of speed you want does really depend. Generally, you want at least 120 for the Space Stealing Station set, and oftentimes you want to look for certain breakpoints like 134 speed to get an extra turn in your first cycle, but generally having a good amount of speed is just useful to use your skill more often, move more, and get a lot of value out of your Kafka. Now, other than just speed, you really want a lot of attack percent to maximize, as I said, all of your damage, and you can also use some hit rate. Now, how much hit rate you need is not actually that much. For an E0 Kafka, you only need 28% hit rate to always apply your debuffs to enemies with the highest resistance as an E0 Kafka. Keep in mind that the 28% hit rate you want is very achievable, as you get 18% hit rate from your minor traces just for free, so you'll only need an extra 10%, which is very easy to get just from substats alone. That's something that you don't have to worry too much about. If you're going for E1 Kafka or her Signature Light Cone or both, then 67% hit rate is going to be how much you want if you want to make sure that you apply these new DOTs you're getting from your E1 and your Signature Light Cone to even the highest resistance enemies in the Memory of Chaos. Because of that, hit rate can be a much more viable substat or main stat if you want to go for the full 67%, if you want to guarantee the application of your new DOTs. If you have less than 67 though, it should still be fine, but that's how much you want if you want to guarantee it with your E1 or your S1. And then for a baseline standard E0 Kafka, you really don't need a lot. 28% is what you're looking for, keeping in mind the fact that you get 18% for free from your minor traces. Other useful substats include crit rate, crit damage, and break effect, but for the reasons we covered, these are not as good as attack percent or speed, which is the main way you want to build Kafka. You don't really want to stack break effect on her. It's not as good as attack. It won't give you nearly as much damage, and if anything, there's a case to be made for testing out break effect on some of your teammates, allowing another character like Serval to fully stack this break effect while not constraining your Kafka in this build, allowing her to build attack instead, maximizing her damage and the extra damage you're giving to the DOTs applied onto enemies without having to spread her build too thin and also build break effect. Keep in mind though, for break effect things in particular, this may require a bit more testing and more theory crafting to be done on exactly how good break effect is, so keep that in mind for now. I'm giving you guys the best general build for your Kafka, and for break effect things, as of right now, it seems like you'd want a dedicated breaker, another character, as I said, if you even want to do break effect things, but there may maybe some more testing that needs to be done with regards to how good break effect is and if Kafka can make use of it herself. So keep that in mind for now. I'm giving you guys the best general builds for her, and if there's anything you want to add with regards to this, it will be in a pinned comment. With that in mind, damage percent is still better than attack, but that is something you can really only get on your light cones or on your sphere. So for your sphere, you really want to go for lightning damage percent over attack. Attack is still viable, but damage percent is definitely better because it is also harder to come by than attack. So if you can, on your sphere, go for lightning damage percent. And then for your other main stats, you typically want attack percent on your rope to maximize your damage. Although if you have your fourth Eidolon, which we'll cover in the next section, you can also go for an ERR or energy regeneration rate rope to let you use your ultimate every 2 turns. For your body, you also want attack percent, generally speaking, as the effect hit rate is typically overkill at E0, although it does become viable at E1 if you don't have enough on your substats. And for your boots, you can either go for speed or attack percent, depending on what exactly you're going for. Again, attack percent will give you more personal damage, but speed can make up for this by allowing you to hit certain speed breakpoints, like the ones we saw earlier. And so for a lot of people, I do recommend going speed because it lets you just go more often, have more turns per cycle, and you just generally get a lot of value from speed. But if you already hit your speed breakpoints through other means, through your substats and maybe some other speed bonuses you're gaining, then you may not need speed boots and can go for attack percent instead. So both are viable and you can choose accordingly. Again, referring to the breakpoints that we saw when I covered the speed stat a bit earlier. All right, now for Kafka's Eidolons, I want to start by saying that she does have some pretty strong ones, but they are not needed to make Kafka strong or to really get the core gameplay of Kafka, who is great even at E0. With that in mind, if you want some early upgrades, you can for sure get an Eidolon like her first one, which will give you a base chance of increasing the DOT received by the target by 30% after being hit by a follow-up attack from your talent. This effect will last for 2 turns and has a 100% base chance, which means that it can still be resisted. Enemies with a high resistance, like 40% at the end of Memory of Chaos, will still need you to have a total of around 67% effect hit rate for you to guarantee its application, which means that going for hit rate on your substats or even a main stat becomes much more viable. Do note though that you trigger your follow-up attack quite a lot as your allies are attacking, so it's okay if you don't have a 100% chance that this applies every single time. Just try to get more hit rate, and then this Eidolon can get a lot of value by increasing the DOT damage that the enemy you're fighting receives. Similarly, for your E2, Kafka will just increase all of your DOT damage by 25%, which is just another great bonus alongside her E1. E3 and 5 increase your talent levels, and E4 will give your Kafka more energy when an enemy takes damage from the shock status, which is really nice, just gives you a ton of passive energy, and can also make it to where you may want to run an ERR rope, as at E4, if you're proccing this effect and also running an ER rope, you can actually be able to use your ultimate every 2 turns instead of the more standard every 3 turns. Lastly, Kafka's E6 will give you a multiplier to the shock that you inflict with either your ult, technique, or talent triggered follow-up attack, as well as also making it last 1 turn longer, so a nice increase in damage, but not the most broken E6, at least from my understanding of it. Because of this, I believe her first 2 constellations are her best ones, especially when you factor in how early they are, but she isn't someone who needs Eidolons, as I said, despite having some good early ones if you want to get them. Lastly, in case you're wondering, regarding her signature light cone and her first Eidolon, I think it depends on what options you have in terms of light cones, as Kafka does have some great ones like a S5 Good Night and Sleep Well, which may make it to where you might want to go for Eidolons instead of her signature light cone, whereas if you don't have a good light cone option, then her signature light cone can gain quite a bit of value. Alright, now moving on, let's get into one of the most important sections, which is talking about Kafka's best teams and characters that she synergizes with. Well, naturally, as the queen of DOT, Kafka's a character who will synergize very well with other characters who apply debuffs to enemies or who can have another dot of their own to deal significant damage over time, alongside your Kafka who can increase this damage. Because of this, Kafka is almost always going to be paired with at least one other damage over time sub DPS, being generally either Luca, Sampo, or also Serval, who can apply shock and help you get more shock, whereas Sampo will give you wind shear and Luca will give you bleed. Now, Kafka's teams are mostly flexible, but you do want at least one other damage over time sub DPS, generally speaking, to really make your uptime on your DOTs and just the synergy between your characters so much better. In a team like this, you want to make sure that your either Luca, Sampo, or Serval has at least 1 speed more than Kafka to make them go first before your Kafka apply a DOT on an enemy, and then have your Kafka go and deal more damage based on how many DOTs are on the enemy, so doing more damage for the shock that your Kafka can apply, and also for the wind shear or bleed from your Sampo or Luca. And so once you have those 2 characters in your team, the other 2 slots are pretty straightforward. In fact, naturally, the next slot is going to be usually another Nihility character. It can be someone else who does damage over time, or a debuffer or a buffer, which is typically what I recommend more. In fact, in an example, let's say you're using Kafka with Sampo, Luca, or Serval, but Sampo and Luca are the 2 that I recommend the most, most, because Sampo and Luca both have really strong dots, and because they're not lightning, you can have a bit more versatility in what shields you can break, while also having debuffs to enemies. Sampo's ult makes them take more damage from DOT, and Luca's ult has a similar debuff, making the enemies take more damage, whereas Sampo is more AoE and Luca is more single target, but both of which are very good options, with Serval being very viable as well. Outside of that character slot though, to move on, you can run two. You can run like Luca and Sampo, and that is perfectly viable, but generally I do recommend running a debuffer just to increase how much damage you're doing from every source. Silverwolf and Pila are both great, Pila being a very accessible and great Forza option who shines in AoE and who will reduce the defense of enemies greatly, whereas Silverwolf has better debuffs for a single target and is just one of the strongest supports you can play in a Kafka team, being really good at reducing the resistances and their defense, making your DOT and just your team's damage overall much higher. So Silverwolf and Pila are both great options that you can use. You can even use a Harmony character like Asta in particular, who will give you a lot of attack and also a lot of speed, which is great for your team, allowing you to go more and deal a lot more damage. Kafka's buffs are team-wide, meaning that you can buff your Kafka alongside whichever other carry you're running. Lastly, in this team, your last slot is going to be a healer or a shielder. Pretty much anyone can work. You can fit what you need in your team, or which healer you have available, or who helps you break shields the most efficiently. You can use a character like Natasha, Luocha, Bailu, technically Fire MC, or especially if you want a shield option, Japard, if you do have him on your account. Overall, Kafka synergizes very well with Nihility characters, can use some buffs like Asta for example, but primarily works with other DOT sub DPS characters and also debuffing Nihility supports, making her really good with other Nihility characters and having very accessible and free to play friendly teams like the ones you're seeing right now, especially when you factor in that Sampo, Luca, and Serval are all on her banner, meaning you can already have at least two characters that synergize well with her. An example team that I was using to fully clear Memory of Chaos was Kafka with Luca, Silverwolf, and then a healer, but there's really so many teams you can do, as we said, that you can test around with and see what works for you. Keep in mind that while you can also use Kafka as just like a hyper carry, I've seen people do it, I don't recommend it as much, and it's not as good. It's not really her playstyle compared to running her with another character who can apply a debuff, like we saw earlier, where Kafka will have a lot more synergy and make a lot more sense. Any future Nihility character that comes out, or anyone that can apply DOTs or debuffs, will inherently have really good synergy with Kafka. Lastly, do keep in mind that for your DOT character in a Kafka team, you want to be building them for their DOT, for their damage over time, meaning they'll also be wanting attack, speed, and an elemental sphere of their corresponding element. And so yeah, overall Kafka is someone who I really like. I'm very satisfied with her, both design-wise and gameplay-wise. Now, I know I'm a bit biased because Kafka and Blade are like my favorite characters, but I really do think that after having played her for a long time now, that she is very strong as a really good lightning carry who excels in AoE situations, but one who you really do need to know how to build and play to get the most value out of. If you just play her in any team without focusing on her DOTs and on your other party members as well, then you won't get nearly as much value. Overall, I am very happy with Kafka, and I hope that you guys are too. Hope this guide was helpful, hope you enjoyed, and as always, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace. Alright, so starting things off, what does Kafka actually do?